Yeah, how to approach this smart city phenomenon. I'm going to be looking at it from 3 different perspectives in a second-tier city, or a tier 2 city in China, Wuhan. This draws on there we are, yeah. This draws in particular on a chapter which is coming out in a book in September, and that piece of research on Wuhan is itself a byproduct of a larger research project which is now in its final months, Smart Eco-Cities in Europe and China. A couple of questions I'll come back to at the end. What's distinctive about the Chinese smart city based on what we can learn from this tier 2 city? And also what this tells us about studying or analysing smart city development elsewhere. Okay, so the first question, just to get my tuppenny in about what's the value of studying smaller cities, because as I'll mention, Wuhan in China isn't exactly a small city, but second-tier cities at least. I think, first of all, it's quite important if we're studying kind of big urban phenomena to avoid the trap of only focusing on best practice cases. I think doing so means that we risk reproducing certain ideological framings through which best practice is defined, even if we're taking a critical approach. So if you're looking at sort of the latest cutting-edge urban technology or different initiatives in Shanghai, when in fact, you know, let's sort of bring in some of the normal urban. Finally, story, the kind of narrative that the city told about itself was so clear. There was a single dominant. There's all sorts of stories, you know, that can be drawn. Cause and effect. Sort of I saw some people nodding before as if they're broadly familiar with the city. But essentially, it's the largest or the most populous city in central China. It's got about 10 million residents, so definitely not a small city. But in the Chinese context, it's a long way off the eastern coastal cities. Back in, say, 1981, it was about the fourth largest industrial base in China. In the decades since then, of course, all the reforms have gone to the east coast, to the big tier 1 cities there, and it's fallen back in relative terms. It's very dependent on heavy industry still, and its average income is very close to the national average. However, there's a raft of national policies in China that you may be familiar with, Go West, or the rise of central China, where they're trying to shift, you know, urbanization into these tier 2 and tier 3 cities, which are away from the east coast. You know, places like Beijing are basically thought to be full. Okay, so Wuhan's a lot of economic growth is expected from Wuhan and possible upgrading of its formal status. So in short, I mean, it's also got a very, you know, very strong higher education industry, lots of high-tech companies there. So there are these sort of indicators that are pulled out to highlight its promise for the future. It's earmarked as, therefore, having significant economic potential. Its success is also intended as a blueprint for other tier 2 cities. So on the one hand, it's an ordinary city, and yet on the other, it serves as a kind of indicator of planned development for Chinese urban space generally in the future. And in terms of the smart city specifically, that's interesting because it's a real pioneer in the field. 2010, it held a very significant competition which catalyzed a lot of things in the city, organized by the local Science and Technology Bureau. And it can now boast this sort of raft of different initiatives that are currently taking place. I'm not going to run through those one by one, but it's a sort of mixture of the normal infrastructural stuff to do with things like parking and sewage and public Wi-Fi, as well as distribution and production sort of systems and a raft of more social stuff. So if you like, these are the officially ratified smart credentials. It can boast that it's doing things. So how do we make sense of all that? I told you I was going to approach this from three perspectives. The first is a more sort of vertical one. I'm talking about policy making from above. I think we can explain quite a lot of what's going on simply by looking at national policies. In China, smart city policies are actually, to a large extent, sort of they come from the center, from Beijing, in a way that they certainly don't in Britain or in the Netherlands or in other places. At the same time, there's a wide variety of policies issued by different ministries. And they've been issued since 2012, 2013, different funding competitions. And a point that I'll return to in my summary later, local municipalities are therefore able to pick and choose between them. It gives them a certain amount of agency. Fragmented authoritarianism. So we could draw up a kind of schematic model like this, where there's a sort of big body of global discourse which is sort of translated or hybridized into national policies, and that sort of shapes what comes out at local level, which is again a hybrid version, which results in certain practices on the ground. Now, that's a sort of very deceptively linear model. Of course, things don't happen like that in reality. I don't think we should reify a body of global smart city discourse as being a sort of static thing or something that comes into being by God's diktat. Of course, these global discourses are shaped by practices and they have their own histories. They're mediated by particular actors from the corporate sector, from the policy sector. They're mediated by particular technologies. But somehow, out of this soup, national governments are able to extract selectively certain ideas and solidify them into policies which do have a shaping effect on what happens on the ground. And I think it's worth emphasizing that. In some other recent work I've been doing, it keeps coming up and up that in urban sustainability studies, for example, the role of national government seems to be, if anything, overlooked. So quite a bit of what's going on in Wuhan can be explained in this vertical way. Equally, though, that only takes us so far. We have to think in parallel of a more horizontal set of agencies. And we can borrow the model of urban entrepreneurialism to explain a lot of what's going on there, to think it through, with some caveats. As a way of narrating changes in Chinese local urban governance, we can't draw directly on this model, which was originally devised with reference to certain Western cities. It's not much help to think about China as being a post-industrial or post-Fordist country. It's not much help to think about China as sort of trying to recover its sort of political sense of self as a result of the collapse of a Keynesian consensus. Nor can we draw on the experience of Eastern European cities who are behaving in entrepreneurial ways. It's just not helpful to talk about China as being a post-socialist country. Equally, though, urban entrepreneurialism in China can't be thought of as a kind of neoliberal rollback of the state. If anything, they're encouraging inter-urban competition and market growth as a way of strengthening the state. So it's got a very local flavor. But nevertheless, you can at least see a lot of very surface symptoms of entrepreneurialism in a place like Wuhan. Here's a poster that was all over the city while I was there. City branding, significant in the fact that it's in Chinese and English, so it's obviously projected to an external global audience. And the idea of Wuhan different every day clearly taps into discourses of flexibility, constant change, that sort of stuff. Actually, there are all sorts of things causing this activity on the ground, these official activities I mentioned before, including investment from abroad, opening up of the conscious opening up of the local economy to different foreign actors, trade offices opening, hundreds of local private companies involved. So we could sort of draw this sort of diagram instead, think about things in a more horizontal way. The local authority working with foreign local authorities, local private sector actors, international private sector actors. And this sense of agency is very much not a sort of hierarchical, coercive one. It's all to do with the local. It's a much more relational sense of agency. I think that has to be taken into account as well. Thirdly, however, I think there's a research problem with the smart city in that you go to a place and you discover that there's no real evidence of it being smart at all. You know, we read all these glossy brochures. In fact, on the second morning I was there, I took this photo of the Yangtze River just by my hotel. The mist evocatively stepping off. And of course, I soon discovered that was heavy pollution. So I know you wouldn't go to Wuhan. So where is the smart in Wuhan? Point that came up earlier. I think it's in things like mobile phones. Okay? Mobile phone use is much more widespread for doing all sorts of things like buying stuff in shops, transferring money. It's in QR codes everywhere that you find. It's in the bike schemes that are all over the place with IGS. So there's a certain sense in which, okay, we've got this smart city idea, but maybe that's just sort of reflecting, or it's catalyzed by a broader digitalization of urban life. And the smart city itself is just a kind of policy label. How much longer have I got? Okay, I might skip over what's distinctive about the Chinese smart city, except to say that a lot of the actual activities that go on, the official ones, are actually indistinguishable from what you find in lots of other places. And yet, I guess what is interesting is that it's a lot more centralized than in European countries. And there's nothing in there to do with the democratization of cities, citizen co-production. It's all in the service of maintaining social stability. But more interestingly, in terms of what I wanted to talk about today, what does that tell us about smart city development elsewhere? I think it stops us from thinking, on the one hand, stops us expecting a kind of linearity of implementation, and yet it reminds us that we should nevertheless bear in mind the shaping effects of policies coming from national government. And broadly, that it's a very flexible concept. That's what we should expect it to be, deriving its legitimacy from and channeling multiple sources and agendas, including the broader digitalization of everyday life. And just to leave you with the sort of analytical dimensions or categories that we ended up with in our Smart Eco-City project, which are quite closely related to this, trying to think through how the smart city manifests itself in different places in a way which is open, sufficiently open to allow these comparisons. And we thought about it in terms of these three levels. Firstly, discourse as, if you like, a set of ideas which are set into a narrative, either a corporate narrative or a policy narrative at different levels. And then thinking simultaneously about the types of institutions at play, the governance models, and their relation to traditional processes and forms of planned urban development. And finally, complementing this, the materiality itself, i.e. the particular technologies invoked or in play, the socio-political implications of these, the relationship with existing urban tech and urban space. By coincidence, it wasn't planned. In another recent paper looking at the UK smart city, where we were thinking of it as a techno-public assemblage, we came out with something quite similar, issues, actors and practices. And again, kind of by coincidence, one of Mike Hodson et al.'s recent papers looking at reconfigurations of urban sustainability said that to understand it in a particular place, we have to think of the way that different discourses are brought into play, as well as particular governance models and the innovations themselves. So I'll leave you with those, and thank you.